Hey everyone, so today I'm going to talk about how to sew on a button. So whether you're going to sew that on by machine or by hand, I'm going to show both ways. And I will show how to sew a shank button, so that's one that has the little shank underneath that you're going to stitch through. And also how to do some of the ones that may have an odd size hole in them, or the odd size width in between the two. I'm going to show you how to do that either by machine or you can do that by hand. So first I'm going to go ahead and show that on the machine. Depending on the machine you have, you may have a stitch on your machine that's already made to sew on a button. So on this machine, the Viking Designer Brilliance, it does have a stitch that is made to sew on buttons. So it shows you here your little button in place. Down here at the bottom, it shows you that your width is set to a 3.0. So that means that it's assuming that the distance between each of those two holes is a 3.0. Depending on your machine, that may be wider. It could be a 4.0. And you always want to test this before you actually sew on your button. But you're going to see here, I have no foot on the machine, just the ankle of the machine. I'm going to place my fabric underneath that I'm going to use to stitch on my button, and I'm going to place my button. So I'm going to place this underneath the foot, and I'm going to go ahead and lower my needle into one of the holes. So we are going to test this by hand first before using the foot pedal of the machine, and I would recommend using tweezers to hold your button in place because you don't want to have your fingers anywhere around here. If you have a sew-on button foot, that would also be great to hold this in place, but for right now I'm going to use these tweezers and I'm going to test the other hole of my button. So I'm going to start to lower that by hand. I can already see that I'm hitting my button, so I'm going to change the width of my stitch to accommodate my button. So you may have to test that a few times just to make sure you're not going to hit or break your button at all. And then you're just going to hold this and you're going to stitch in place. If you do not have a sew-on button stitch on your machine, you can set your machine for a zigzag stitch to the proper width of what you need for the size of your button, and you can drop your feed dogs. For some machines, you can just set that into free motion, and it will drop your feed dogs, or you may need to manually drop your feed dogs. Depending on your machine, you can check your machine's manual. What's important is that you want to make sure that your needle is only going left and right and isn't actually moving your fabric forwards or backwards, because for sewing on a button on the machine, you want to make sure it's not going to move your button out of position. So you want to have your feed dogs dropped so that it's only going to go left and right of center and tack your button in place. To sew a button on by hand, you are going to thread your needle and tie a knot at the end of your needle, and you're just going to go through and stitch your button in place where you want it, and you're going to go through between 6, probably 4 and 6 times, just to make sure that everything is on and that everything is secure. And I'm making this nice and taut so that the thread is going to lay nicely through my button. And once you've gone through enough repetitions, on the back side, you can tie yourself another knot to secure. Then you can put a little bit of seam sealant or a little bit of fabric glue on the back of here to help make sure that your stitch is going to stay nice and secure. To stitch on a button with a shank is going to be very similar to stitching one with holes. You're just going to run your thread underneath and through the shank, and this one you're probably going to want to go through a few more times just to make sure that your stitch is going to be nice and secure. But you're going to run it into your fabric and then in through your button shank. And you want to make sure that you're stitching into the bottom section of the button so that you can get a nice secure button. So you're going to stitch that probably 6 to 8 times to make sure that it's nice and secure, and then this one you can actually tie your knot from the top side. So I can tie this underneath my button and I can secure it on top. I'm going to go ahead and just tie some little knots on here before I trim my threads. And there is your shank button.